Okay, go. I got a joke for you. You ready? Why did the bicycle fall over? It was too tired. Okay, so here we got a joke, everyone, from Jessica. What did their parents say when they heard that oxygen and magnesium were going to get married? OMG. I heard it. Why can't pirates remember the alphabet? Anyone? No, it's not because of R. It's because they always get lost at sea. Yeah, they're all good. Everything about me is good. Just kidding. Here we go. Any questions about the synchronous material before we get started? Where did we leave off? I can't remember. Where did it leave off? I think we reintroduced a lot of the spinal cord anatomy, correct? So there's no questions about this sort of stuff. This was all review, right, from the neuroanatomy lecture. Hopefully, you guys sort of like remember it a lot better. Now that we've gone through all the pathways, we've gone through sort of the control circuits, hopefully you get a better idea of how the neurological system sort of is working together through different connections to get everything, and in this case, like in terms of motion, get everything moving. Remember, let's see, is there anything really out of line that you guys didn't understand? I would know this slide for the exam. This is going to be helpful in just understanding the tracks. So these are all the ones that we spoke about. And then so you would organize them in the columns like I suggested so you get a better idea. There's sensory and then there's motor. So this is sensory. And this is motor. Yep, there will be diagrams on the exam. Just like in the first one. First midterm, sorry. So the questions on the exam, there's going to be 45 multiple choice and then 25 marks for short answer. And it's going to be a short answer question from one short answer question from each lecture. And then correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but we have a review lecture next week, right? Oh, yeah, an unlimited time. Yeah, yeah, we have a review lecture. Yeah. So then we can go over a lot of the material. Is it proctored? Yeah, we have to do monitoring with the faculty got back to me. So their response was that just have no time limit, or like, well, I'm going to have no time limit, so that way if anything happens, then you can just log it back in and it's back to normal. Yeah. You're welcome. You know what I did realize though, as like a self-critique, I think that on the videos that we post after the recorded ones, the group chat doesn't show up. So when I'm talking, people that didn't see it are going to be like, what is he talking about? Because they can't see the comments. Well, like to be honest, I don't even know when I thought classes ended on the like 7th. Yeah, there you go. So I don't know. Sophia, buddy. It's okay. Do you want the class? I think we should have a review class. Yeah. Because then you can all just ask questions. Okay, but Zafir, I want you to come in with a heavy joke, like the best one you can think of for next week. Okay, deal? Done. Okay, good. What do you bring? That's the class day. Yeah, you can do. We can do that. We can have like a little like review session and then. Okay. Okay, let's get started. So I reviewed this information on that asynchronous lecture, correct? Okay. So we will start now with spinal cord motor coordination. So remember, the purpose of the course is to understand the neurological system. It's a neuroscience class, but that we want to highlight or specify how the motor system and the sensory system and the neurological system is utilized in movement or motor coordination. And so when we're talking about the spinal cord, we reintroduce the anatomy so you're more aware of it and how everything sort of fits together. But now we're going to understand about how the spinal cord itself is more than just a conduit. Like, it's more than just a wire that goes from the brain to the spinal nerves. It actually is involved in a lot of coordination, a lot of motor coordination, and that's as a result of connections through interneurons. Because of all of the connections that go in and out of the spinal cord, of all of those types of axons or connections that can happen, it's only the axons of the dorsal column that do not synapse at the spinal cord. So everything going in and out of the spinal cord is synapsing with interneurons and then gets sort of like relayed all around. So with the amount of connections that occur, we have the coordination of movement occurring as a result of those interneurons within the spinal cord. And so if we have signals going in and out that are sent to other areas in the spinal cord to interact with other sort of neurons, we have interneurons regulating motor coordination. And that's through processing and modulation. Now, remember we had said that if you had for every one sensory neuron, there was 10 motor neurons and 100,000 interneurons. So of the vast majority of connections in the neurological system are as a result of these interneurons. And so they act as relays between the sensory and motor tracts. So interneurons are sending a signal and either dividing it or converging it or using that signal to sort of have an effect on other parts of the neurological system. So the interneurons themselves don't function in isolation without input. They act as relay centers. One of the sort of like the easiest examples that we had discussed thus far in the course was how we use interneurons when talking about reflexes. So we had signals coming up. Do you guys remember like reciprocal inhibition, or we talked about the myostatic reflex, withdrawal reflex, those reflexes? How we had a pain signal coming in and then having an effect on exciting flexor muscles and inhibiting extensor muscles with withdrawal reflex, for example. That's an example of how a interneuron or interneurons within the spinal cord are involved in motor coordination. It's not that the signal goes up to your brain, you realize you've hurt yourself, and so you consciously move your hand away. This is an example of how a signal through interneurons is affecting movement. Now, that's a simple example, but we have that type of coordination that occurs at different areas, and we're going to discuss somehow. And the goal of sort of this lecture for me is partly to have you sort of understand how just the vast majority of connections is how we have the neurological system, specifically the spinal cord, being able to help modulate or process information for movement. Through the integration of these signals, and that happens peripherally and then in combinations with the signals coming down from the brain and then the signals coming up from the periphery, they all combine together to modulate sensory information, coordinate movement patterns, and they can also be used in autonomic regulation, which we didn't really discuss a lot in this course because it's more for homeostasis of the body. Now, when we were talking about how we decide to move a particular muscle, we activate our upper motor neurons that synapse with lower motor neurons, right? So we have the upper motor neuron tracks. Do you guys remember what the difference were between the medial and lateral upper motor neuron tracks? Those are the motor tracks that are coming from the motor planning areas in the brain, and they go down to the spinal cord, and then they exit from the spinal cord at whatever particular level they end through the lower motor neuron. So medial upper motor neuron tracks were for what specifically? What kind of muscles? Yep, medial is postural, and then lateral would be for fine control. Yeah, fine control of breathing. So like more like sensitive, fine movements. Yeah. Okay, so it's one thing that I want you to understand is that it's not like one action potential from the upper motor neuron goes to one action potential to the lower motor neuron. We have a integration of information as a result of all the different inputs that can be coming in. So we have the one upper motor neuron, but we can have different inputs from proprioception, from sensory information. We can have modulation coming down, fight or flight. That can come in and modulate. So we have an integration of all of this information through inner neurons that all synapse together in real time, so are all like communicate with each other in real time. So we have a summation of all of that information that's going to summate and decide whether or not the lower motor neuron will fire. Because once we have a motor unit firing, it's an all or none response, remember? So some of the activity that it is sort of integrating is all of the afferent information that's going to come in from our sensory information. It synapses in the spinal cord, then goes up, right, for these afferents. We talked about like proprioceptors, so not the ones in the dorsal column, but proprioceptors, like all the information, inner neurons, and then descending signals from the brain. So here's an example of how potentially we have the same descending command. It can be sort of affected by the presence of afferent information from an interneuron. So this is a highly like simplified sort of reason or highly simplified example. But can everyone see my cursor? On the left-hand side here, we have an example of, we have the brain. So think of like the motor planning areas. So primary motor cortex sending a signal that you want to activate 3 different neurons. So let's look at the quad, the calf, and the tibia. Okay. So for the purposes of the diagram, muscle 1, 2, and 3. So the command from the brain is fire these 3. However, remember, when it synapses from upper to lower motor neuron, there's all those inner neurons that are going to relay the information. So here, we can see that the inner neuron connects directly with the lower motor neuron. This one is connected to an inner neuron that sends a signal back to 3, and the black eye means inhibit. So this inner neuron sends a signal to muscle 2, but inhibits muscle 3. So the original signal is fire these 3 muscles. However, because of the presence of interneurons, and in this case, interneuron 2, just randomly, in this case, the way it's structured, it's designed to inhibit interneuron 3. So in the presence of this signal, because of this interneuron, we only have muscle 1 and 2 firing. So you see the checkered line. It means muscle 3 is not firing. This is a very simplified sort of example of how the reflex centers in the lower back work with the stepping pattern generator. Because what would happen is in the presence of a specific type of afferent information, pull on a muscle, pressure on the feet, something, right? It doesn't have to, afferent just means sensory information. In the presence of a specific type of afferent information, like in the second example, that afferent information turns off the second interneuron. So in the same signal, turn 1, 2, and 3 on, both examples. In this one, in the presence of afferent information, which turns off interneuron 2, interneuron 3 is now no longer inhibited, so it fires. So in the presence of afferent information, whatever it may be in this hypothetical situation, in this case, muscle 2 and 3 works. So does that make sense? Same command, but we have modulating of what actual signal is output to the lower motor neurons as a result of how all the summation of all the information from the interneurons sort of work together. And in this case, the very simple example would be a type of sensory information coming into the spinal cord from some type of sensory, and it's turning off an interneuron. And so think of how we have 20,000 synapses happening at once when you go from upper to lower motor neuron. It's not just one. We have a summation of 20,000 different signals all occurring at once that will finally decide through summation whether or not the dendrites on the lower motor neuron are going to generate an action potential. Because once it starts, then it's gone. Do you guys understand that? And that's how we have coordination in the spinal cord. Because it's not like a brain's stuck in there. It is the summation of all of the different sort of signals. Is it frozen? Guys? No. Oh, very good. Okay. Do you guys get that? Everyone? I want 68 yeses. Okay, cool. Right? So that's a simplified example. Now try and wrap your head around 20,000 all happening at once. Think about a specific question about what you don't understand, Zafir, and then ask it, because chances are there's someone that's not going to understand as well. And that your question will help them understand. Okay. So there are going to be, is that the specific number of signals? In what do you mean? 20,000? Well, I just got it from the slide, so that it just said on average, the synapses that are occurring are 20 to 50,000. So just an estimate. Yeah. It's not a cap at 20,000 or anything. So here we go. So what I wanted to do was now that we understand on a very simple example of how interneurons are contributing to motor coordination, let's talk about 4 different examples. We've talked about reflexes before. So let's first start off with a stepping pattern generator. Does anyone know about what a stepping pattern generator is? And we talked about it briefly when we discussed the basal ganglia. Remember how we had one of the outputs of the basal ganglia being to the midbrain locomotor region? And then the midbrain locomotor region was turning on the stepping pattern generator to the lower back. The stepping pattern generator is a rhythmic collection of interneurons that are designed that once they're turned on, they rhythmically make the hips flex and extend. Because when you're walking, are you concentrating, I should flex my hip now? That you're not concentrating on the timing. You just get it going, and then you tend to focus on your calves, and you're focusing on other things, right? Like where you're going. We're not consciously working our hips. That rhythm just kind of occurs. We all agree on that? The reason why that happens is because we have a set of interneurons in the lower back, specifically to all the muscles that are going in the lower legs for locomotion or for walking, that they rhythmically turn off and on. So once you turn them on via the reticulospinal tract with the midbrain locomotor region, once you turn it on, the rhythm just kind of keeps going, unless you stop the rhythm and then you stop walking. So like I said, it alternatively activates the flexors and extensors motor neurons going through the legs and hips. And this is kind of what it would look like here. So this is, again, a very hypothetical example. Now, this is the stepping pattern generator for one side. So this would be one leg, okay? So the upper motor neuron, what was the upper motor neuron tract that turns on the stepping pattern generator? It was in the previous slide. What is the upper motor neuron tract that turns on the stepping pattern generator? That was in the previous slide. Yeah. And that one's important. We know about that one from the basal ganglia lecture. Because we get inhibition of the midbrain locomotor region, which stops the rhythm of walking, why people with Parkinson's disease get the freezing gait. But in this example, this is an example of a stepping pattern generator, and this is one side of the body. So there would, for like, so let's say we talk about the lower back or the lumbar spine, the lower spinal cord, there would be one on each side. Here's how it works. We have the reticulospinal tract coming down. It's a lot more complicated than this, but I just made 4 to sort of like simplify the whole idea for you. So here we have upper motor neuron tract, where the reticulospinal tract. This is where it synapses in the spinal cord. These are the lower motor neurons. And between the upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron, we have a collection of interneurons. These interneurons are going to be the stepping pattern generator. Now, the way it works is that these turn off and on to rhythmically turn on either the flexor muscles or the extensor muscles of the leg. Because if you're rhythmically, so think of this just one side, you're flexing, extending, flexing, extending, flexing, extending the hip, right? It's obviously a significantly larger amount of muscles, but this is the simplified version. And so the way that it works is through timed interneurons. So initially, let's go through this example. Initially, you're going to go, I want to walk. Reticulospinal tract is going to turn on the stepping pattern generator. Now, what happens is that initially we get a signal that comes down to interneuron 1 and 3. Okay? Now, the way that it's sort of structured is that the signal first hits number 1. Number 1 turns on interneuron 2. This red is inhibitory. So initially what happens is the signal comes down to both 1 and 3, and then 1 activates 2, and 3 activates 4. But the timing of it is that 2 fires first, and 2 inhibits interneuron 3, okay? Interneuron 1's associated with, no, because reciprocal inhibition is when you like go to consciously flex a muscle. But same idea, exactly same idea. Right? Just the way, I should have made it a little bit like shorter on one side. When the signal comes down, it tends to hit this one first, in this case, which is going to turn on number 2, which inhibits 3. So initially, we only get extensor muscles working. And then after a set number of, like depending on how fast you want to walk, after a set amount of time, this timed interneuron turns off. So then we get the activation of interneuron 3. When interneuron 3 fires, it will activate number 4, which turns off number 1. So I know that sounds a little bit confusing, but the big key here is that these interneurons turn on either the extensor or the flexors. And it's through these inhibitory interneurons that selectively turn off and on a rhythm that we get turning on the stepping pattern generator. It's the rhythm through the timing of these interneurons that are going to adjust based on how fast we want to walk and the type of locomotion that we're performing. That's going to rhythmically turn off and on these interneurons, or rhythmically turn off and on the lower motor neurons to the extensor and flexor muscles. Yeah, so it's exactly a relay system. The big key is that these interneurons, the inhibitory ones right in the middle, these 2 and 4, they're timed. And so if you look down at the sort of like the description of the figure, like I took it from the textbook. It says exactly that, what I just said. So if you wanted to open up the file, that'll be there, then you can read through it if you forget. It's the time, it's that these 2 interneurons here are timed. So we get reflexive turning on and turning off. You guys okay with that? So here, sorry. Sophia, are you good? You may be gone. Awesome. Okay, cool. You guys are good. You guys are all good. Okay. So this was an example using 2 interneurons. Okay. So now I'm going to show you just like a little bit more difficult of an example. Same diagram, but remember how your body responds to all of the afferent information that's going to be coming back into the spinal cord. It's going to affect the activity of all those interneurons. So this diagram is just to depict that in real life, it's a lot more complicated, obviously. So now we're going to have sort of afferent information from our muscle spindles and GTOs in the muscles and the tendons and the ligaments. That information is going to come into our stepping pattern generator and alter the activity of which extensor muscles and flexor muscles that they're sort of connected to. So it's through the use of all of this interneuronal connections that we have a stepping pattern generator integrating limb position, status of muscle contractions, the relationship of the limb to the environment, whether it's stepping, whether it's like a soft ground. All of that information is getting put back into the stepping pattern generator. And so all the interneurons are integrating information. It's like a microchip, but it's not conscious because it's all just connections. Tension in, like when you're walking and you step on, like when you're walking on uneven ground, you're not looking at, oh, okay, there's a divot, there's a stick, you kind of just go with it, right? Depending on, let's say that you step on a stick and you dorsiflex a little bit more, it's going to affect how the muscles are sort of contracting, because that all sensory information just goes right back to the spinal cord, and then that through interneurons just adjusts the output from the stepping pattern generator. Jacob asked question. So if it's not an inhibitory movement, the automotor neuron signal goes to 1 and then to the extensor muscles, correct? Yes. So it's just for that example, because what happens if, like, so on the one side we have extensor first, that means, because it's opposite, right? Because we have one stepping pattern generator for each side. So that means the other one's going to start off at with the flexors. So I just made the first one. I had to pick one side. So I picked extensors for the first example. I had to pick one. So really, what's going to be integrating in is that, like, what given that circumstance, what leg is forward, what leg feels stronger, what has more tension, probably what weight is on which side. All of that stuff's going to go in, and then figure out which one you go with first. I think it was important for me to show like a simplified example, but just always understand that it's just integrating so much information. It's pretty cool. So we all get the stepping pattern generator? Okay, awesome. So again, the whole point of this lecture is to understand how that before people used to think that the spinal cord was just, the spinal cord just connects from the brain out to the body, like that's what it does. But then when they started realizing it, it integrates so much information. And then this is just, again, highlight, like, so same example of how afferent information can affect the activity of a muscle. So given different, like, sort of like swing phase versus stance phase with walking, that proprioceptive information would be different, and then would work to either inhibit or activate a muscle at the spinal cord. So this is the spinal cord. So one interesting thing. Oh, I wonder if I can. I have a video to show you guys. So one interesting thing about the stepping pattern generators, to sort of prove their existence, is that with spinal cord injury patients, like they can't consciously walk, right? So there's spinal cord injury patients, they have a break somewhere or a cut in the spinal cord somewhere, so signals aren't like crossing. Signals aren't coming up and signals aren't going down. If you have a patient lying down, you can artificially stimulate that stepping pattern generator in their lumbar spine, and then if you use EMG, which is like checking muscle activity, you can see reflexive turning off and on of the flexor and extensor muscles. So let me move one slide forward. And can you guys see this? So here we have a hypothetical like spinal cord patient. So paraplegic. So let's say they had so let's say they had a break here. So let's say they broke their neck and they can't move their legs. Deal? What they've done is they take an epidural electrode. So they take an electrode, they stick it into the spinal cord right here, turn it on. So they turn on electricity to turn on the stepping pattern generator. And what they noticed was that when they used electrode recordings, they found that there was a rhythmic activation of the leg muscles right here, similar to walking. So they artificially turned on the stepping pattern. Yeah, it's pretty cool. Oh, but wait, there's more. Because this is how you can potentially use electronics to get a paralyzed person to walk again. Now there's stem cells, so now they can just make this obsolete. But anyway, but the point is this is how they started rehabbing spinal cord injuries. So let me show you this diagram. Can you guys see this? I'm gonna have to share my screen. Hold up. New window, new window. Design. Screen. Can you guys see this? Kind of. Oh wait, I'm gonna lose the chat. Unless I do this. Hold up. I'm gonna figure this out. Let's take this. Okay, and go like this. Oh no. Okay, then we go like this. Bam. Okay, can you guys see? Okay. So this is a Locomat machine, and what you do is, like, I don't know if you guys can see really well, but we have a paralyzed person here, can't walk, can't move his legs. So one of my buddies has one of these. It's in Whitby, Neurochangers, cool guy. You put the paralyzed person from a harness, so they're hanging, right? And then this is the machine that it moves the legs in the rhythm of walking, and then it lowers them so that way their feet start touching the ground as a treadmill. And then what happens is that the signals, because proprioception, all the afferent information, because they're bearing some weight, the signals get sent up back to the stepping pattern generator, or well, just up back to the spinal cord. So remember, the way to heal a nerve injury is trying to get signals, right? And it tends to try to get them to reconnect. This way, by having afferent information, it is helping the person trying to like refigure out how to walk if they still have some control, or it helps try to stimulate some of the areas to regrow so they can have some connections reconnected. Can you hear it? Boom. Oh, yeah. So to put him in a harness. Everyone's ahead of my friend. They're trying to book patients. I'm busy. Okay, so you guys see how he's harnessed, right? So he's suspended, right? And so there's some ideas on how to use stimulate the stepping pattern generator while doing this. So he's strapped in, he's harnessed, and then they're hooking the machine up to his legs, and then you turn it on, and then it mimics walking. So it's mimicking the rhythm of walking. So if they can replicate what the afferent information will be, it may better help with the connections to reconnect. Yeah. It's the machine moving his legs. So what they do is they do that, so it's moving, and then they start to lower him, so that way the feet are touching the ground. Think back to the stepping pattern generator examples, right? It was afferent information would come into the spinal cord and then affect how the muscles contract, right? So that to best sort of replicate how it actually works would be the best environment to try to stimulate the neurological system to regrow. So that's why with rehab, it's like it's something you try to move it, continually try to move it in a regular. There, see now it's touching the ground or above the treadmill. Can you guys hear the nurse talking? The video is like on the lecture slides too, so I would go back and look at it and stuff. But she's telling him to try to concentrate on certain things.
You're fine.
Remember, he's a paraplegic. Like paraplegic, he's not controlling his legs.
To work on some of that motor planning with gait and ambulation, as well as allowing him to take some of his weight back while he's walking. So with the body weight support harness and everything, we're allowing him to take some of that weight, focus on the motor planning and the gait pattern, and actually work his way through the gait cycle. This has been an excellent tool for Glenn, as I think it's really helped us with his transfers, ability to tolerate upright standing.
Cool. So Robert asked, would he still have proprioception in his legs? And yes, because remember, the break with a paraplegic is in the spinal cord above, like his neck, somewhere in his back. So all of the wires that are from his legs up to the spinal cord, they still work. They're still there. It's the muscles that atrophy. Mm-hmm. Cool. Like I'm kind of simplifying everything, obviously, but that's basically how it works. Can you post an announcement on the finals test? Yep, yep. Because don't forget, Thresh, we have a review class next week. Yes, and that would also reduce atrophy as well from Alana. Yeah, because you're moving it, right? So you're trying to get the signals. So just an example of I don't know if you guys have ever heard this story, but if you guys ever heard that, like, you can Google it. The story of Mike the Headless Chicken. You've heard the story? Oh, that's awesome. Okay, so this is an example of, so it was a farmer. She was cooking chickens, and so she cut one off, but she cut at the top of its head, so its brainstem was still left intact. So all of its sort of homeostasis and regulatory functions were still available, and so it stayed alive for 18 months after. She would just feed it with food coming out of eyedropper. And so all the circuits for locomotion were still intact, right? Because the thing was still alive, so it could walk around. Yeah. Mike the Headless Chicken. Okay, so that was one example of how interneurons are used with coordination. Now let's review the reflex centers that we talked about in the motor system lecture. So we had talked about three main reflexes, and they're going to be important to know for the exam because, again, they are utilizing the spinal cord for motor coordination in a sense. Do you guys remember the withdrawal crossed extension reflex? Yeah, it's grosser that they kept the face. I think actually that's just like a Hollywood like fake, because like if it was still alive, wouldn't the head like disintegrate, like decompose? It's gross. So you guys don't remember does anyone remember the withdrawal crossed extension reflex? When you step on a nail, what happens reflexively? So let's say I step on a nail with my left foot. What happens? Yeah. That leg will flex, right? So then, therefore, what would the interneurons? So the pain signal is going to get sent up to the spinal cord. It's going to send that information to interneurons. So for that foot, what's getting turned on through interneurons and what's getting inhibited by interneurons? I mean, it's on the slide, but use your brain. So, but for the ipsilateral side, ipsilateral means same side. So the side that you stepped on, are you turning on flexors or turning on extensors? You turn on flexors, yes, exactly. Right. So that's through interneurons. Pain signal goes up the spinal cord. The interneuron excites the flexors, inhibits the extensors, so you pull your leg away. That's through interneurons. So interneuron is causing motor coordination. So here we have that happening. I guess you can't really see, but that's a guy stepping on a tack, and he's pulling his foot away. And so we have activation of the flexor, inhibition of the extensor. Okay. And then as Apollo said, what happens to the opposite side? Contralaterally. So opposite, contra means opposite. What happens to the leg on the contralateral side? Extension. So when you talk about reflexes, you have to say inhibition or excitation or activation. So on the right side, we activate extensors. No. Okay, wait. Before you guys all answer. On the contralateral side, extension, yep. So we get inhibition of flexor, perfect. And then Brittany and Jacob said we get excitation or activation of the extensors, correct. Because then you're going to step. This is perfect. You guys, good job, guys. So when discussing the reflexes, you just want to talk in terms of what's getting excited and what's getting inhibited. So when we have a cross extension or a withdrawal reflex, on the withdrawal side, on the ipsilateral side of the painful stimulus, we get an activation of flexors and inhibition of extensors. And then at the same time, on the contralateral side, on the standing leg, we get an activation of extensors, and then we get an inhibition of flexors. Trick for remembering. I think just simplifying it, really. Imagine it, and then like obviously, even with reciprocal inhibition, if you're going to activate the flexors, you want to inhibit the extensors. I would think of it visually. Like if this is what's happening, right? The left foot up, right foot down. Obviously, flexing, you're activating flexors, then and therefore inhibiting extensors. And then on this side, you are activating extensors and then inhibiting flexors. Here we have reciprocal inhibition. So what does reciprocal inhibition do? When we consciously activate a muscle, we want to turn off the antagonist. So we're going to cause a myostatic reflex on that opposite side, and the muscle will go into spasm, or the limb will go into spasm. So when I flex a muscle, I reflexively turn off the antagonist muscle. So in this case, I want to flex my quad. Let's say I want to flex it quickly. I reflexively turn, right? So we have the upper motor neuron that's going to go say, turn on quad. Through interneurons, it's going to send that signal to the quad, but it's also going to send an interneuron that reflexively inhibits the flexor, or so the hamstring in this case. So that way, we don't get a myostatic reflex as a result of the muscle spindles in the antagonist muscle. So that's another example of how we have one signal it's getting coordinated or modified as a result of interneurons. Does that make sense, everyone? Okay. Boom. Okay. And then the last reflex example, recurrent inhibition. So now this is a little bit different. Recurrent inhibition means you inhibit the muscle that you're trying to activate. Now this is specifically for muscles of fine control. You know, when you're like trying to do something very accurately, what tends to happen? You slow down, right? Because you want to be more accurate, right? So usually with fine control stuff, there is a what's called Renshaw cells. So coordination at the spinal cord. It reflexively also so you're sending a signal to turn on the hand muscles. There's an interneuron that reflexively inhibits that same muscle just to make it slower, just to make it a little bit slower, so that way you can maintain fine control. So even when you really want to, like, the send command is activate all these muscles, especially when it's fine control muscles, there's going to be a little bit of a braking system. And that's recurrent inhibition. Recurrent meaning you're inhibiting the same muscle, or reciprocal inhibition means you're inhibiting the opposite muscle. Yeah, exactly. Brittany said, like, slowing down, like putting a thread through the eye of a needle. Think about any motor task. When you want to do it really accurately, you slow down. Cool. Okay. So now we're going to finish off the last 8 slides of the course. We're going to talk about what happens now, because we talked about the spinal cord. We talked about how it's involved in movement or motor coordination. It's through the use of these interneurons and connections. Now let's talk about what happens when we get lesions or injuries to the spinal cord. What can happen? Now, understanding what's going to happen is going to have, you're going to need to understand the tracks that we talked about in that cross section of the spinal cord. So if you understand that diagram, I think it might be coming up. No, 1 second. Hold up. This diagram, if you understand this diagram, if I get a cut or an injury in the spinal cord, you're going to understand what it's going to do in terms of like a deficiency based on its location. Because we know all these tracks now. We talked about them all. So if you know where the injury is, then you can say, oh, okay, well then that's what it's going to have a problem with. So okay, but that's okay, Brittany, because we have like 20 days before the exam, which is, I think, sorry, not 20 days, December 9th, 15 days. And I gave you this chart. You got this. 13 things. 13 things. Brittany, I bet you can remember 13 of your friends' birthdays. And the best way to do it is to organize it. So you're gonna remember, we're gonna make the column, 3 different columns. No. So yeah, you just need to know, look, there's 13 different tracks. That's all of them. That's the course right here. And then you're just basically knowing what they do. Origin, what they do. So we had we'll go through right now. We had our 3 columns for our sensory motor tracks. No, you can't have a cue card. You will understand it though. Practice. So next week, what I want you to do is we're all going to bring a piece of paper, and we're going to learn by the end how to practice memorizing the 13 different tracks. Because I think you're getting overwhelmed with the numbers, but remember, it's just grouped in. So we had our 3 main types of sensory tracks. We had conscious relay tracks, medial divergent system, unconscious pathways to the cerebellum. Those 3. In the motor tracks, we had medial, lateral. That's it. I know, but you will. Yeah, you do. But it's like so we're just talking, I don't know if you can't see the group chat. We're discussing on how to sort of remember that. It's through organization. So we just talked about 5 different groupings, and then this chart here is all of that. They just haven't grouped them. So that's why I want to create a columnized grouping so that way you can memorize it. So by understanding where what the tracks are and by where they are located in the spinal cord, then you can understand what a spinal injury would have, like where the injury is, what would it do to the body. Do we need to label? Yeah, probably. Okay. So let's talk about lesions, okay? Depending on where we get a lesion in the spinal cord, so the spinal cord comes down, and then at each level of the vertebra, there's 2 spinal nerves that exit, right? So depending on where the lesion is, we can get a lesion affecting the tract 1. Yeah. And the chart after that. So 14. Okay, so depending on where the lesion is, we can have either a segmental loss or vertical tract loss, or both. Okay, so this is where like the lesion's located in the body. So have you guys ever heard of a disc herniation? Right. So a disc herniation is an example of a injury to the spinal cord, but it affects only one segment because it's only affecting the nerve root or like the spinal nerve. Whereas when you get like, you know, a spinal cord injury where like you fall and it cuts half the spinal cord, that's going to cause a vertical tract lesion because it's the tracts that are coming up and down the actual spinal cord, those are affected. So here, if I can give you an example, see how we have, so this is one level of the spinal cord, right? So here we have all of the tracts going up and down, right? These are the tracts that you're going to memorize, the 13. Here we have spinal nerves that are exiting the ventral root or coming into the dorsal root. A disc herniation is like pinching on the spinal nerve. So it's not affecting any of the main tracts, it's affecting the signals coming in and out of the spinal cord. So therefore a disc herniation affects only a dermatome or a myotome, one specific level. Whereas if you had a disc herniation or an injury that's putting pressure or causing an injury to the actual spinal cord, it's going to affect everything coming up and down. Ventral is front. Yeah. Okay. On the diagram, right here, front. Remember, motor is red, sensory blue. Is good? Okay, so let's talk about differences between the two. 1 second, Brandon. When we go back, I'll show you. So if we get an injury to this segment, we're going to have loss of, when we have, we're going to talk about either the sensory or the motor problems that will occur with a segmental lesion. And so this is when we have a focal lesion involving a single segment of the spinal cord. So in the motor, we're going to have, or sorry, sensory, if the lesion affects the dorsal root, the dorsal horn, or the spinal nerve, we're going to get loss of sensory within a specific dermatome. If we get a lesion of the ventral root, the ventral horn, or the spinal nerve, because the spinal nerves are mixed, we're going to have loss of motor function or weakness over a specific myotome. Okay? And so if we sort of understand either the myotomes or the dermatomes from the asynchronous lecture, we can compare or sort of diagnose or infer whether or not someone has a peripheral nerve injury versus a spinal nerve injury, if you guys remember from last lecture. Dermatome is the sensory associated with a particular spinal nerve. Myotome is the muscles associated with a specific spinal nerve. Myo means muscle, derma means skin. So here we have an example of a segmental lesion. So if we had, so imagine the dark as like a break or a cut or something. if we had a cut here, here, or there, we're going to get loss of motor for C5. If we get a cut here, here, or here, we're going to get a loss of motor from C5, or sorry, of sensory from C5. If we get a cut specifically in the spinal nerve, we're going to lose both motor and sensory from C5. So in this case, we have an example of, like, let's say a disc herniation at C5 or that level. So we get an impingement of the right C5 spinal nerve. So in this case, we're going to get a loss of both sensory and motor from this spinal nerve because this is where the injury is. So you can see that on the diagram. We get precess of muscles innervated by C5 and C6 combined with a loss of sensory information at this level. And so they get a loss of, you can see in this case, we have a loss of sensory from the C5 dermatome. And this is a segmental lesion. It's only affecting one spinal nerve. Does that make sense, everyone? Perfect. So then the difference would be that if we get an injury in the actual spinal cord itself, we're going to get an affecting of the tracts. So all of those 13 tracts, dorsal column, spinocerebellar tract, the medial pain pathways, the corticospinal tracts, that's what's going to get affected. And then it affects everything coming up or down. So if it affects an ascending tract, so tracts coming up, it's going to affect sensory. So the ones that we talked about were the dorsal column and the spinothalamic tract. If it is affecting the descending tract, so motor tracts coming down, we're going to lose that type of muscle. So fine control, or if it's a medial neuron tract, posture and control. Now, with vertical tract lesions, we also get problems with autonomic system because the autonomic trunk is different. It's a sympathetic trunk. They come out at each level and it creates like these ganglia along your thoracic spine. Those would be affected too. So with vertical tract lesions, we also get autonomic problems. But so here we have an example of a vertical tract lesion. Can you guys see? So in the previous example, it was a cut here, just the spinal nerve. In this case, let's say the guy like fell off a horse and like broke his one of the vertebral bodies and it crushed the spinal cord. It screwed up everything on his right spinal cord. So all sensory and motor tracts that are located on the right side, what's going to happen? So it affected, let's see, it's happening at C5. He crushed his neck at C5. So the spinal cord is crushed on the right side of C5. Not just the spinal nerve, the vertical tracts. What's going to happen? Symptomology. He's going to have, below that level, none of the motor tracts are going to work. So he's going to have paralysis of anything below C5, right? He's going to have a loss of discriminative touch, proprioception of vibration. So the dorsal column from the right side. And then he's going, because remember the spinothalamic tract crosses over at the spinal cord, he's going to lose the spinothalamic tract or pain and temperature from the opposite side of the body, from the left side. Because remember, the spinothalamic tract comes in, crosses over, and then comes up. So right here, you can kind of see the arrows if you guys like zoom in. We have our dorsal column coming up from the right side of the body, comes up to the brain and then crosses over, whereas the spinothalamic tract, pain and temperature, comes into the spinal cord, crosses over, and then comes up. So we're going to lose right side, so this is let's say this is the right side. We're going to lose right side motor, right side proprioception and vibration and touch, left side pain and temperature. Because of the fact that the spinothalamic tract, that pain and temperature one, weirdly crosses over at the spinal cord. It's the only one that does that. So back in the day when we didn't have MRIs or a better understanding, people were always like, I don't understand how you get a crossover of a loss of some sensation on one side and not on the other. Like, how does that work? It's because the wires turn over at different spots. Okay? It's really the spinothalamic tract is the one that does that. So it's the only one that's sort of like, oh, okay. So if you have an effect here, it's affecting the opposite side of the body. Do you understand that? So we need to know all the tracks and where they cross over. Yes. So Brittany, the big one is just to know that the spinal thalamic tract is the only one that crosses over at the spinal cord. The rest cross over at the medulla. And you don't need to know this for the course, but the spinal cerebellar tracts, the cerebellar ones don't cross. Well, you won't be asked that. We're just talking about symptoms. So sensory loss and motor loss is the big one. And so know this for the exam. Okay? Because really, based on the location of where they're going to get an injury with like spinal cord patients, there's really only 4 different types of like injury combinations that they get. There's anterior cord syndrome, so the anterior cord gets injured. Central cord syndrome, when the center of the cord gets injured. That's usually from like a tumor or there's like sort of like a hole where cerebral spinal fluid comes through. If that gets blocked, it like pushes out, so you can get an injury to this like the inside of the cord. Brown C-cord syndrome or a hemisection is what we just talked about, where half the cord gets cut. And then cauda equina is when we get a spinal cord injury where we have the cauda equina. So these are the 4 different main of like injury combinations that we can get with spinal cord injuries. When you ask the question, spinal thalamic is the only one that crosses over spinal cord. Yes, there you go. You're basically just past the course. Okay, so let's go individually and understand this. So, okay, question, guys. Based on the diagram, what area is going to be affected? Oh, it's right on the diagram, but if we get an injury to the anterior spinal cord. Can I just show you the diagram? Because we're all going to look at it anyway. So here we have a diagram. Here we have what's anterior cord syndrome, right? Yes, exactly, Jacob. Loss of motor function, right? So, and then see how like, so this gray is injury, right? So we're going to have loss of motor function. And based on the location of the spinal thalamic tract, it's right on the outside. So that's going to be affected too. So we have paralysis, loss of all motor information below, and loss, because it's both sides, the loss of pain and temperature. The one that's intact in this case is the dorsal column. So they would still have fine touch, proprioception, and vibration of everything lower. So here we have an example of anterior cord syndrome. It results in a loss of the spinal thalamic tract and motor tracts of everything below. And can you guys see that? Because if you look back to that diagram, slide 13, is it slide 13? Slide 12? Slide something? It's affecting those tracks. So with anterior cord syndrome, loss of motor and loss of pain and temperature below the injury site. Everyone okay? And that's just depicted here. Okay, now we have central cord syndrome. What do you think is going to get affected if we have an injury to the inside of the spinal cord? So Brittany, what's the one that crosses over? There you go. So because it's the one that crosses over, when we get a swelling in the inside of the spinal cord, that's the one that gets affected first. So and then it starts to swell and gets worse and worse and worse, and then affects more and more tracts. But initially, we get a loss of pain and temperature at that level. See, it's not everything below because it's already crossed over and then comes up down the sides. It's only that level with central cord syndrome that we're going to get affected. Postural muscles as well. It would affect the. Let me see here. If the lesion is large, it'll start to impact the medial upper motor neuron tracts. Because in this diagram here, it's only affecting just this gray matter, but it'll start to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and then start to impact on like through here. And this is where the medial upper motor neuron tracts are. So as it gets bigger, it would start to affect the postural muscles. But for the purposes of this diagram, it just started, so it's only going to affect the spinal thalamic tract of that level. Is everyone okay with that? Awesome. Now, Brown C-cord syndrome, or a hemisection. We already talked about this. Here we have an example of this happening in the lower back. They broke T10, so he did something. I don't know. I don't want to make up an injury. because of bad karma. But he lost half of his spinal cord at this level. Someone tell me the 3 different symptoms. So the 2 different sensory types and the motor loss of where that would be. Where's he going to lose motor? It's the right side. T10, right side. So he's going to lose motor function of what area? Yep, loss of motor on the right. Where is he going to lose fine touch, proprioception, and vibration, or loss of dorsal column? Right? No, right? Yeah, it's okay. Lowercase Jamie. Okay, and then last one. What side is he going to lose, or they are going to lose? Hand temperature. Right, so you can't just say, so Carolyn, you can't just say sensory loss because there's 2 tracks that are conscious sensory, right? There's pain temperature, spinal thalamic, and then there's the dorsal column, which is fine touch, proprioception, and vibration. 2 different sets of wires. So depending on which one's affected is what you're going to lose. So you lose 1 dorsal column from right side in this case, but spinal thalamic tract of the left side. So it's spinal thalamic tract and the dorsal column. Okay, so think about, let's say the injury's here, right? So I don't know if you guys can see this, but remember, neurons of the spinal thalamic, of the sort of dorsal column of fine touch, proprioception, and vibration, they're going to come up, right? They go into the spinal cord, and they come all the way up the right side, hit the medulla, and cross over. So you have an injury here. It's right side, fine touch, and proprioception nerves. The spinal thalamic ones would come in, they would cross over, and then come up the left side to get to the left side of the brain. So in this injury, the pain and temperature neurons from the right leg aren't affected because the injury's in the spinal cord. So in this case, they have loss of pain and temperature from the left side. And that's the issue with a hemisection of the spinal cord. I know. Kelly's just saying it's hard because like anatomical left and right. I'm just imagining if I was standing there, but like I was imagining it like me standing. Sorry, Kayla. Okay, well, I don't know. Okay, so then if this is anatomical right and left, Kayla, I don't know, you want to screw people up? So this would be a injury to the left spinal cord. It's going to affect, well, that doesn't matter. You know what a lot of people say? That's why they say contralateral versus ipsilateral, because it doesn't matter right or left. They just say one side of the body versus right side of the body. So with a so this is the way to say this, is that with a hemisection, you get loss of ipsilateral, same side, motor and fine touch, proprioception, vibration, contralateral pain and temperature. Yeah. Okay. And then the last one is cauda-equina syndrome. Yeah, for sure. When you say ipsilateral versus contralateral. In fact, you know what, guys? Remember it that way, and then if you see it on an exam, then write right or left based on that diagram. Yes. Brittany. Okay, so this is the last type of spinal cord injury, and in this case, cauda-equina syndrome is when we have a spinal cord injury to where the cauda-equina is. So as a practitioner, when people come in and they have a loss of sensation from a disc herniation, what we do is we make you ask them about bowel and bladder and like the sensation around, like, this is sound gross, but like around their anus, because that is a medical emergency. Because if they have a spinal cord injury where the cauda equina is, there's a lot of autonomic neurons that go to your bowel and bladder in that area. So if you get an injury in that location, you lose that function. And so things won't regulate, and then like your colon can burst, and then you die. Like that's very bad to go septic. Yeah, it doesn't happen a lot, obviously, but it's like a medical emergency. So cauda equina syndrome is when you get an injury to this area, to the cauda equina area of the spinal cord. Okay. So those are the 4 different like main types of injury like paradigms you can get in the spinal cord. This is what we learned about today. And then next day, what we're going to do is we're going to sort of review everything. So Brittany is going to remember the 13 tracks. Zafir is going to remember that diagram. And then together as a class, we're going to learn the course. Oh, no, sorry, Zafir. You're going to come with fire jokes. Yeah. And then we'll take a poll on how many yeses it was funny and no's it was not funny, and then that's what we're gonna do. Okay? No, man, Zafir's the man. He works well under pressure. He wants more pressure. Okay, deal. So Kayla, the big thing with central cord syndrome is that it affects just the center of the spinal cord. So the one that it's affected, all the tracks going up and down, they're fine in the spinal cord. It's whatever tracks are crossing over. So with the track that crosses over is the spinal thalamic tract at that level. So let's say they had the injury here in the central cord, it's the pain and temperature from just that dermatome. Yeah, better? Awesome. Okay, guys. I have patience. That's a herniation. What do you mean? Disc herniation. Is that what you mean? No. This is from usually a tumor. Disc herniation usually affects like the spinal nerve. So this is usually like, yeah. Okay, bye guys, bye. Go save the world. Go be the best you. Smile a little bit, eh?